concept. And for a long time on the self-esteem front, there was this idea that positive affirmations for children were the way to self-esteem. But that was dependent on the theory that your level of negative emotion was dependent on your attitude towards yourself, something like that. It was only a psychological variable. But what Twenge found was that all that false praise, that devaluation of the currency of reward, that overgeneralization of insistence upon your child's singular wonderfulness at the expense of other people, it didn't improve self-esteem. What it did was inflate narcissism. So then you got the best of both worlds. You got kids that were just as miserable on the negative emotion front, just as confused and anxious, but they're also narcissistic. And so that actually produced a bit of a spiral because, you know, it's a little bit more difficult to make friends if you're high in negative emotion because you're a bit more volatile, you're a bit more sensitive. You're also a little more timid in your social interactions. So you already got a couple of things working against you. Now, if you add a nice healthy dose of narcissism to that, then you're going to produce a child who's unbelievably unpopular and dislikable because there's almost no one more dislikable than a neurotic narcissist. That's a tough combination too, because you get that hypersensitivity along with grandiosity. You might be able to tolerate one of those, but man, the combination of that's pretty damn unbearable. And so all this idiot insistence on self-esteem through continual affirmation, you know, that would also be part and parcel of the elimination of competition in schools, right? Because you don't want anybody to lose because God only knows what that might do to their self-concept and their self-esteem. You produce this increase in self-centered narcissism and you make kids more isolated and miserable and lonely than they would have otherwise had to be. It's a real perfect storm. A lot of that can be laid at the feet of social psychologists, by the way. So doing very, very badly thought through and analyzed research in clinical domains. The whole self-esteem, bloody, monstrous movement, that's one of the catastrophes that's emerged out of the research fields.
I also think parents have been encouraged to be therapists to their children, to be counsellors. And what you mentioned earlier about feelings, when I worked with parents, it was constantly, you know, a child would come home and say, somebody kicked me in the playground. And the first question from the parent was not, so what did you do about it or what happened? But, and how did that make you feel? And right. And how did that make you feel? And how did you feel about that? And what it does is it gives power to feelings above actions. And so you get a child who, then the child stops and thinks, well, how did I feel about it? And it's usually, you know, sad or angry or happy, you know, this sort of very limited range of feeling words. And so then the child's thinking, that's the important thing. And it's always back to the child looking internally rather than looking outside and saying, so this was what the situation was. And then maybe if the child was being bullied or maybe if the child had a part in it, we listen to that, we can, perhaps help the child manage it better next time. Or maybe the child doesn't have a problem with it at all. Is just sharing some information with us. But if we bring that back every time to the child's feelings, then the child is growing up thinking, my feelings are the most important thing.
Okay, so let's look at that. So first of all, we might ask, what the hell do we mean by feeling? And what we mean is something like immediate emotional response. Okay, and then we say, well, feelings are paramount. We're also simultaneously saying immediate emotional response is paramount. Okay, so let's just think about that for a minute. So let's say my wife says something that makes me angry. All right, so why aren't I just right? It's like you just said something that made me angry. Now I'm angry. My feelings are paramount. I'm angry. I feel like hurting you, let's say, because I'm so angry. Why am I not right in doing that? And why are we insisting to children that their instantaneous emotional impulse is the appropriate marker for reality? Because the alternatives would be, well, who cares what you felt about it? What did you do about it? Or on the bullying front, let's say, what are you going to do about it? Independent of your feelings, whether you're angry or upset or or looking for a fight or challenged, whatever. I want to know how you're going to cope with this situation actively so it doesn't occur again. And then by walking through that, let's say if you're talking to a teenager, you're also privileging thinking over feeling. And so then you might say, well, what is thinking? And the answer is, thinking and acting are what mature people replace feeling with. So the only time we need to feel something, especially on the negative emotion side, is really when things don't go the way we want them to go. So you feel, forget about positive emotion for a minute, you feel in consequence of inadequate adaptation. That's like a rule. And so to privilege feeling means you're privileging inadequate adaptation. And you're also saying, well, your first impulsive whim, which is driven by these basic biological mechanisms that are very id-like in the Freudian sense, they're not sophisticated at all. By making them paramount, you raise them to the point of the highest virtue. The highest virtue is what you feel. And then it's even worse than that, Stephanie, because this is so awful. It really is. If you do careful linguistic analysis of communicative content, one of the things, and emotions, let's say, communicative content and emotion, one of the things you find reliably is all self-conscious thoughts load on neuroticism. So there is literally no difference between thinking about how you feel and being miserable. They are exactly the same thing. So what you're doing with, it's so interesting, it's so sad, right? But you can kind of understand this if you think about self-consciousness. So imagine you're on stage and you're delivering a talk, and all of a sudden you get self-conscious. Well, you think self-consciousness is a good thing. It's like, no, it's not. You sweat, you blush, you stutter, you forget what you're doing, you collapse into yourself, you get self-centered, you don't pay attention to the audience, you're no longer able to communicate, and it can be a real catastrophe. Like, people can get so self-conscious on stage that they develop a phobia of public speaking. And that's all pathology of self-consciousness. And so now what we do with our children at every bloody turn, and they do this in school all the time, well, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? And the other implication there, and you talk a lot about nonverbal behavior in your book and how we communicate with children. We're also telling our children all the time that if you feel bad, anxiety, let's say, or some emotional pain, that's so awful that that's all sensible and caring adults should ever care about. And so what kind of message is that for children? It's like, oh my God, you were upset at school. What a cataclysm that is. We should probably restructure the entire social apparatus so that never even happens once. It's multidimensionally preposterous. And it's really hurting kids to make them self-conscious like that.